Moving to East Africa's Tanzania, the Tanzanian president has lashed out at several Western nations, particularly the US, for interfering in the country's internal affairs. Speaking at the 60th anniversary celebration of the Tanzanian police force, the president, Samia Suluhu Hassan, had explicitly said that her government should not be told how to run the country.
To Tanzania now, the mining sector over there is growing pretty fast. In the first half of 2025, it pumped nearly $700 million into government coffers, surpassing a target of $400 million. Now, this highlighted the country's growing role as one of Africa's top mineral exporters. With the data, here's CGTN's Isaac Lucando.
They say lithium powers the future. From your phone to your electric car, this silver-white metal is the backbone of the 21st century. But in Tanzania, lithium is more than a commodity. It's a weapon, a bargaining chip, and a challenge to America's long-held dominance over Africa. Tonight, we reveal the untold story behind a deal that Washington doesn't want you to understand, a deal that could reshape Africa's economic destiny. A deal where lithium isn't just a metal. It's power. Tanzania sits on one of the largest untapped lithium reserves in the world. Estimates suggest enough to supply the global electric vehicle industry for decades. Yet for years, foreign companies profited while local communities saw little benefit. Until 2023, the rules were clear. America, Europe, and Asia dictated. The price, Tanzania mined. The world bought the profits, mostly exported. The control, mostly foreign, but something changed. The government decided to renegotiate, demanding more control, more revenue, and stricter environmental protections. Suddenly, Tanzania wasn't just a supplier, it was a player. America, heavily dependent on foreign lithium for its tech and defense industries, watched nervously. A country used. Two dictating trade terms now faced a bold, independent Tanzania. Washington didn't want to lose access. And when influence failed, pressure followed. Diplomatic letters, trade warnings, threats of sanctions, all aimed at one goal: ensure America retains control over Africa's most critical mineral. But Tanzania refused to back down. They understood something America often forgets. Resources are power, and power, once claimed, cannot easily be taken. In late 2023, Tanzania signed a historic deal with a consortium of African and Asian partners. It included strict revenue sharing, local job requirements, and mandatory lithium processing within the country, a move that threatened to bypass American intermediaries entirely. This wasn't just business. It was a statement. Africa will not be a passive supplier anymore. And the message sent shockwaves through Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and Washington's corridors of power. By controlling extraction and processing, Tanzania could dictate global prices. By processing locally, it could retain billions that previously flowed overseas. And by negotiating with multiple partners, it could avoid dependence on any single superpower, especially America. The world was watching. China, already a major player in African lithium, welcomed the move. Europe, hungry for sustainable energy resources, calculated risks. And America faced a stark choice: negotiate fairly or risk losing influence over Africa's critical mineral sector. For the first time in decades, an African nation was calling the shots on terms that favored its people, not foreign investors. For Tanzania, it was a triumph. For America, it was a warning. Lithium isn't just a metal, it powers the devices we can't live without. It drives the cars we aspire to own. It fuels the future of clean energy and modern warfare. Whoever controls lithium controls the next century. And Tanzania just reminded the world that Africa is no longer a silent supplier. The deal is more than economics, it's sovereignty. It's Africa's taking a claim in a world that has long ignored its value. America responded. Cautiously, trade delegations were sent, pressure mounted through diplomatic channels. But Tanzania stood firm, leveraging its strategic advantage to secure better terms for its citizens and its economy. It was a reminder that the balance of power is shifting. Africa is no longer content to sell raw materials cheaply. Africa is learning the art of negotiation, and the world is watching. This deal is not just about Tanzania, it's a template for Africa's future. Other nations are watching, asking the same question. Why should we give away our wealth for crumbs when we can build our own prosperity? Tanzania's courage could spark a continent-wide movement, one where African nations own their resources, process them locally, and invest in their people, where power is measured not by foreign approval, but by sovereignty and self-determination. The lithium under Tanzania's soil could fuel cars, phones, and grids. Or it could fuel a revolution in economic independence across Africa. The world thinks America dictates Africa's fate, but in the shadows of Tanzanian minds, the story is changing. Lithium isn't just power for devices, it's power for nations. Tanzania versus America isn't just a trade dispute, it's a battle for Africa's future. A battle over who decides the rules, who controls the wealth, and who shapes the destiny of a continent that has long been underestimated, and the world is only just beginning to understand. Tanzania's lithium reserves didn't just attract investors. They caught the attention of the most powerful nation on earth, the United States. But America wasn't just worried about supply, it was worried about precedent. If Tanzania succeeded in negotiating fair terms, keeping processing local, maximizing revenue, and diversifying partners, other African nations would follow. Ghana, Zimbabwe, Democratic Republic of Congo. Suddenly, Africa could control its resources, its trade, and its destiny. America knew that if Tanzania set the example, decades of influence could be threatened. For years, Washington dictated prices and supply chains. But Tanzania's bold stance signaled a shift. The Tanzanian government insisted on local beneficiation, meaning the lithium mined in their soil would be processed within the country before export. This simple step could increase the country's profit margins tenfold, and more importantly, it meant the value of Africa's resources stayed in Africa. For America, this was a wake-up call. For Tanzania, it was the moment to assert sovereignty and strategic independence. Lithium powers more than technology. It powers influence. It powers alliances. It powers nations. And now Africa was learning to wield it like a weapon. America responded quietly at first, sending trade envoys, proposing partnerships, offering financial incentives. But Tanzania remained firm. No sweetheart deals, no shortcuts. Only fair terms that benefited the nation and its people. The world may have underestimated Tanzania's courage, but one thing became clear. This was no longer a simple trade dispute. It was a test of Africa's ability to reclaim its wealth. And as other nations watched closely, one question began to spread across the continent. If Tanzania can take control of its lithium, why can't we? The lithium deal is more than a commodity transaction. It is Africa's quiet revolution, one that America cannot ignore and one the world will soon have to reckon with. Lithium. It may seem small, just a mineral buried in the soil. But in Tanzania it is power. Power over trade. Power over technology. Power over the future of Africa. For years, foreign corporations dominated the mining industry. They extracted Tanzania's minerals at minimal cost. They exported raw lithium to Asia and Europe. They profited enormously while the country and its citizens received a fraction of the value. But the rules were about to change. In 2023, Tanzania declared a bold move. All lithium must now be processed within the country. Foreign companies were required to form partnerships with local investors. Revenue sharing would favor Tanzania, and environmental protections would be strictly enforced. This wasn't just a domestic policy, it was a direct challenge to American influence in Africa. America had relied on Africa's lithium for decades. From Silicon Valley's tech giants to the Pentagon's defense contractors, Tanzanian lithium fueled critical industries. When Tanzania imposed new regulations, U.S. officials saw it as a threat, a small nation asserting control over a resource that powers the modern world. A single change in Tanzanian policy could ripple through global supply chains. Battery manufacturers might face shortages. Prices would rise, and America's strategic leverage over Africa would begin to fade. America's response was swift but subtle. Instead of overt threats, Washington deployed diplomatic pressure. Trade envoys visited Dar es Salaam. Letters were sent. Companies warned of potential risks. In investing under new regulations, behind closed doors, Washington made its intentions clear. Tanzania cannot disrupt the supply chain without consequences. But Tanzania remained firm. The government understood one fundamental truth. Resources are only as valuable as the nation that controls them. If Tanzania gave in, it would be a century of lost potential. If it held firm, it could redefine Africa's role in the global economy. Tanzania didn't just resist America's pressure, it built alternatives. Processing plants were constructed locally. Local engineers were trained. Partnerships with African and Asian investors were formalized, reducing dependence on Western buyers. By controlling the processing and trade of lithium, Tanzania gained negotiation power. Not just with America, but with the entire world. And this power came at a critical time. The world is entering a lithium boom. Electric vehicles, renewable energy, smartphones, every device, every car, every solar panel relies on this mineral. Tanzania held a key piece of the puzzle, and it wasn't going to give it away cheaply. The ripple effects were immediate. China, already dominant in battery production, welcomed Tanzania's policy, eager to secure long-term supply agreements. Europe, dependent on both lithium and ethical sourcing standards, took notice. And America faced a dilemma: adapt to Tanzania's new rules, or risk losing access entirely. For Tanzania, the move wasn't just economic, it was geopolitical. The nation wasn't simply selling lithium, it was reclaiming its voice on the global stage. The policy wasn't just about global influence, it was about Tanzania's people. Jobs were created, infrastructure improved, revenue stayed in the country. And across Africa, a message was sent loud and clear. Your resources are yours to control. If Tanzania could do it, why couldn't others? Ghana, Zimbabwe, Democratic Republic of Congo. The continent was watching, and America, long accustomed to dictating terms, was suddenly on the back foot. The lithium under Tanzania's soil is more than a metal. It is power, sovereignty, and opportunity. It is Africa reclaiming its wealth. It is the start of a new economic era where nations negotiate from strength rather than dependency. The battle isn't over. America is adapting, other powers are maneuvering, and the global tech industry is watching every move. But Tanzania has sent a clear message. Africa will no longer be a passive supplier. Africa will determine its future. And in this battle for lithium, one truth is undeniable. The future of Africa is being forged in the soil beneath its feet. Tanzania's bold stance did more than anger foreign corporations, it forced them to adapt. Companies accustomed to buying cheap, unprocessed lithium now faced a stark choice: comply with Tanzania's rules, or lose access entirely. China moved quickly, signing long-term agreements to secure lithium supply. Europe's tech giants recalculated costs, and America tried persuasion, incentives, and behind-the-scenes diplomacy, all with limited success. The United States had relied on a system where African resources flowed almost automatically into its industries. Tanzania disrupted that system. By demanding local processing and fair revenue, it shifted the balance of power. This wasn't just about economics, it was about sovereignty. Every ton of lithium processed on Tanzanian soil represented billions retained within Africa, funds that could build schools, hospitals, and roads instead of lining the pockets of foreign companies. And the impact spread across the continent. Other nations watched closely, seeing Tanzania refuse external pressure and secure better terms. A wave of possibility emerged. Africa could control its resources, process locally, and negotiate as equals on the global stage. But the challenge was far from over. America could not afford to lose influence. Diplomatic pressure increased. Trade warnings escalated. Even international media coverage began framing Tanzania's policies as risky or anti-investment, yet Tanzania stood its ground. By building local processing plants, training engineers, and forming diverse international partnerships, the nation created a buffer against foreign pressure. No single superpower could dictate terms. No external actor could easily bypass Tanzania's authority. And while America and the West tried to regain influence, Tanzania quietly strengthened its position. It wasn't a battle fought in headlines or courtrooms, it was a strategic chess game with lithium as the key piece. This is Africa's new reality, a continent learning that its resources are more than raw materials. They are tools of power, sovereignty, and development. The lithium beneath Tanzania's soil is not just metal, it is leverage, it is independence, and it is proof that Africa can finally decide its own future. Tanzania's lithium revolution is just beginning, and the world is starting to realize that Africa will no longer be a silent supplier. Tanzania's bold lithium policy had sent shockwaves across the world. But for America, this was more than a trade disruption, it was a challenge to decades of influence in Africa, and the response was coming. Washington began its counterstrike quietly. Diplomatic envoys were dispatched. International media framed Tanzania's policies as risky and unpredictable. Financial institutions warned investors of possible instability. But Tanzania was prepared. The nation had built a strategy based on sovereignty, diversification, and African unity. America's diplomats weren't used to resistance. They were accustomed to influence, subtle or overt. But Tanzania refused to bend. By establishing local processing plants and partnering with multiple nations, Tanzania reduced its dependence on any single power, especially the United States. This wasn't just economics, it was geopolitics. Every ton of processed lithium represented freedom from foreign control. America's next move was strategic. It wasn't a military action nor overt sanctions. It was influence through finance and diplomacy. Trade agreements were delayed, loans were questioned, corporate contracts were scrutinized. The message was clear: follow our rules or face economic consequences. But Tanzania's leaders had calculated this risk. They knew that Africa's resources were not for sale at any price. And with alternative partners in Asia and Africa, they were ready for the pushback. Instead of retreating, Tanzania strengthened internal capacity. Local engineers were trained. Revenue-sharing policies ensured that profits stayed in Tanzania. Communities around the mines began seeing real benefits: schools, hospitals, and infrastructure, funded by lithium wealth. By investing in its people, Tanzania created resilience against external pressure. It wasn't just about minerals, it was about national empowerment, and across Africa, a powerful message was sent: control your resources, control your future. Tanzania's stance reverberated across the continent. Ghana, Zimbabwe, and the Democratic Republic of Congo began reviewing their own mining policies. The era of passivity was over. Africa had witnessed one nation asserting sovereignty over its minerals, and it inspired the rest. Africa's youth began to see that resources weren't just raw materials for foreign powers. They were leverage, opportunity, and national wealth. The lithium boom was not just economic. It was a blueprint for African independence, a model showing how nations could benefit without sacrificing control. As Tanzania consolidated its position, America realized something critical. It could no longer dictate terms unilaterally. It had to negotiate, adapt, and respect Tanzania's sovereignty. The country's leverage had shifted. By controlling extraction, processing, and trade routes, Tanzania was no longer a passive supplier. It had become a global player, a nation whose decisions affected markets worldwide. The lithium under Tanzania's soil was no longer just metal. It was power, influence, and a statement. Africa will no longer be sidelined in its own future. This is Africa's moment. The continent is waking up to the value of its resources. The continent is learning that its wealth is not a gift but a tool for independence. America may still exert influence. Other powers will compete, but one truth is undeniable. Africa is claiming control over its destiny. Tanzania versus America isn't just a trade dispute. It is the beginning of Africa's economic revolution, one lithium deposit at a time. Tanzania's defiance did not go unnoticed. Every ton of lithium processed locally sent ripples across global markets. America realized that it could no longer rely on old systems of control. The rules had changed, trade warnings and diplomatic pressure were only partially effective. American corporations, accustomed to cheap raw materials, were forced to negotiate on Tanzania's terms. For the first time, a small African nation dictated terms to a superpower. But Tanzania wasn't acting recklessly. The government had built multiple safeguards, diversified partners, robust infrastructure, and trained local engineers. Every shipment, every contract, every deal was carefully calculated to maximize national benefit. Locally processed lithium meant billions stayed in Tanzania. It funded schools, hospitals, roads, and communities that had long been marginalized. It also sent a signal to Africa. Resources are tools of development, not just exports for foreign profit. Across the continent, Tanzania's courage inspired change. Other nations began reviewing their mining policies, asking, if Tanzania can assert control, why can't we? Suddenly, the idea of African resource independence was no longer theoretical. It was tangible. America, however, was not ready to relinquish influence entirely. It deployed a new strategy: partnerships with African allies, alternative supply deals, and lobbying for multinational agreements that could counter Tanzania's rising power. But the advantage had shifted. Tanzania was no longer a passive supplier, it was a global player. Every ton of lithium exported from Tanzania now carried more than economic value. It carried leverage. It carried diplomatic power. It carried a message. Africa is reclaiming its wealth, and it will not be dictated to. For the people of Tanzania, this was transformative. Jobs, infrastructure, education, the benefits were real. And for the continent, it was symbolic. Africa could develop, negotiate, and grow without waiting for permission. Tanzania versus America is no longer just a trade conflict. It is Africa asserting its place in the world, one mineral deposit at a time. And the question now is, who will follow? Tanzania's lithium revolution is more than a national story. It is a continental awakening. For decades, Africa's resources were a silent gift to the world, mined, exported, and exploited. But today, Tanzania has sent a clear message. Africa will no longer be a passive supplier. The world felt the shockwaves immediately. America, once assured of uninterrupted supply, found itself negotiating on Tanzania's terms. China, already a dominant player, secured long-term agreements but had to respect local processing rules. Europe recalculated prices and investment strategies. Lithium powers modern life, electric cars, renewable energy, smartphones. And whoever controls it controls influence, innovation, and global strategy. Tanzania's success is not just in wealth generation, it is in empowerment. Local engineers are trained. Communities thrive. Revenue stays within the country, building a foundation for self-reliance and future growth. And the message is spreading across the continent. Nations rich in minerals from Zimbabwe to Ghana, from the Democratic Republic of Congo to Namibia, are rethinking how they negotiate with foreign powers. Africa is learning that resources are not a gift to the world. They are a tool for sovereignty and development. The lithium boom is just the beginning. Other minerals, cobalt, rare earths, gold, and uranium could follow the same path. Africa's economic future is being rewritten, one mineral at a time. America, long accustomed to dictating terms in Africa, faced a stark reality. Its influence over African resources was no longer guaranteed. Tanzania had set a precedent, and the message was unmistakable. African nations can and will negotiate from a position of strength. America began to adapt. New partnerships were formed. Investment strategies were revised. Trade negotiations became more respectful, more balanced. For the first time, Washington understood that Africa's voice matters. The tables had turned, no longer a supplier to be controlled. Tanzania had become a global player. Tanzania's lithium revolution had consequences far beyond its borders. Prices stabilized as Africa asserted control over its own minerals. Innovation accelerated as local processing created new technologies and industries, and geopolitical power shifted as nations learned that control over resources equals influence in the 21st century. The revolution is not just in boardrooms or mines, it is in the hands of Africa's people. Young engineers, miners, entrepreneurs all participating in a future that belongs to them, not to foreign interests. For the first time, wealth from Africa's soil is invested in Africa itself rather than exported. This story is not just about lithium, it is about narrative and power. For too long, Africa has been defined by what the world took from it. Now, Africa is defining itself. Through bold policy, careful negotiation, and the courage to resist pressure, Tanzania has rewritten the rules. The continent is watching, and the world is taking note. Africa's resources are no longer passive. They are active agents of change, shaping economies, politics, and futures. The lithium under Tanzania's soil is more than metal. It is hope, leverage, and independence. It is the first chapter of Africa's economic renaissance. America may still hold influence. Other powers may compete. But Tanzania has proven one undeniable truth. Africa can and will shape its own destiny. The world thought it controlled Africa's resources, but Africa was only beginning to control itself. Tanzania's story is not just a single chapter in Africa's history. It is the opening of a new era, one where nations reclaim control over their destiny. For decades, Africa's minerals were exported, refined abroad, and sold back at inflated prices. Now, Tanzania has shown the world that value begins at home. Every ton of lithium processed locally is a statement of power. It is proof that Africa can manage its resources responsibly, profitably, and independently. And it is a warning to powers who believed they could dictate terms. The ripple effects are already being felt worldwide. Battery prices stabilize as African nations assert their policies. Technology industries adapt to new supply chains, and nations that once treated Africa as a passive supplier now face a continent demanding respect. But the true impact is felt at home. Communities once marginalized now thrive. Children attend schools funded by resource revenue. Engineers and technicians gain skills that were once inaccessible. Tanzania is building a workforce for the 21st century, while creating wealth that will circulate locally for generations. Across Africa, the message is clear. Your resources are your future, not your gift to the world. Other nations are taking notes, reviewing mining policies, and seeking ways to retain value within their borders. Africa is awakening to the reality that sovereignty over resources equals economic freedom. Tanzania's lithium revolution is a blueprint for the continent. It demonstrates that careful strategy, bold policy, and unwavering courage can reshape economies, strengthen communities, and change global power dynamics. It is a story of resilience, vision, and the unyielding belief that Africa can determine its own future. The world may still attempt to influence Africa. Other powers may compete for access, but the tide has shifted. Tanzania has proven that Africa will negotiate, protect its wealth, and invest in its people. The lithium beneath Tanzania's soil is more than a resource. It is a symbol of power, independence, and Africa's rising voice in the world, and this is just the beginning.